The studio lights glowed with a soft amber warmth as Tamron Hall's crew rushed across the polished floor, adjusting cameras, checking microphones, and running last-minute sound tests. Today's guest was one of the biggest names in Hollywood, Denzel Washington, and while the atmosphere in the audience was electric, the mood backstage carried an unmistakable strain. Word had spread quietly among the producers that Denzel wasn't in his usual steady, composed spirit. Something was off. No one could pin down exactly what, but even the interns could feel the subtle tension pulsing through the air. Tamron, flipping through a stack of cue cards, tried to shake it off. She had interviewed presidents, artists, and controversial figures with grace, and she wasn't about to let nerves take over. But for reasons she couldn't quite name, a tiny knot settled in her stomach. Maybe it was because she respected Denzel. Maybe it was because she knew he didn't tolerate nonsense. Or maybe she sensed the storm before anyone else could. Denzel arrived with his usual understated style, dark suit, calm expression, and that focused, almost regal posture that made everyone straighten whenever he entered a room. He greeted the staff warmly enough, but even his smile carried an edge of distraction. He had been navigating a tough press week, filled with misinterpreted quotes, online debates, and critics twisting his statements for viral headlines. He wasn't angry, but he was exhausted with the noise. And today, whether intentional or not, he brought that frustration into the studio. When the cameras finally rolled and Tamron welcomed him to the stage, the audience erupted in applause. Denzel offered a controlled smile, waving lightly before settling into the chair opposite her. At first, everything played out the way daytime television was supposed to: polished, engaging, professional. They laughed about early career stories, discussed behind-the-scenes moments from his latest film, and even exchanged a few heartfelt reflections about legacy and purpose. But then Tamron shifted toward the topic her producers insisted on addressing: the recent controversy swirling around his remarks at a previous event. She wasn't trying to start a fire, she just wanted clarity from the man himself. She always believed honesty served the audience best. "There's been a lot of conversation about some comments you made last week," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Some people say your tone came across stronger than usual. Do you think you're misunderstood sometimes?" The question hung in the air. Denzel's eyes narrowed just a fraction. He repeated, slower, "Misunderstood." It wasn't irritation, it was more like he was weighing the intent behind the question. "I think people misunderstand a lot," he continued. "Mostly because they're listening for scandal, not substance." Tamron kept her expression soft but steady. She tried to gently guide the conversation. "Right, but because your voice carries so much influence, do you ever feel a responsibility to?" "I know exactly what my responsibility is," he cut in, his tone firm, controlled. "And I don't think I need to explain myself just because others twist things." A small wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Tamron glanced briefly toward her producer, who gestured for her to move on, but Tamron didn't want to appear intimidated. She had handled tougher guests. She kept her voice calm, almost reassuring. "I don't think anyone's trying to twist your words here. I'm only asking because people are talking about it." "People are always talking," Denzel replied sharply. "Doesn't mean they're right." The temperature on stage seemed to rise. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension growing like static. Before a storm, Tamron attempted a light-hearted approach. "Well, the good news is, you're here to set the record straight." But Denzel wasn't letting it go. "I'm here to talk about the film. Not to defend myself against gossip engineered for clicks." Her smile faltered for just a second. Not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough for him to notice. "No one is attacking you, Denzel," she said quietly. "I'm just giving you a chance to speak to your fans. Then maybe," he leaned forward slightly, voice low and measured, "you should ask why your colleagues in the media keep stirring it." That line hit harder than anything he had said so far. A stunned hush swept through the studio. The audience exchanged wide-eyed looks. Tamron straightened her back, professionalism snapping tighter like a wire. Denzel's implication wasn't subtle, it was direct. Too direct for daytime TV. "So you're saying the media is at fault?" she asked, her tone holding a new steel. "I'm saying people who chase drama instead of truth are at fault," he replied. "If the shoe fits, wear it." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The producers froze. Tamron stared at him, steady but burning inside. And in that moment, everything began to unravel. The silence after Denzel's last sentence was thick enough to feel. Even the cameramen hesitated, their hands hovering over controls as though any wrong movement might spark the explosion waiting to happen. Tamron Hall inhaled slowly, her expression composed but unmistakably changed. She had been challenged before, politicians, celebrities, activists, but rarely had a guest pushed her boundaries live on air with such directness. And certainly not someone as respected as Denzel Washington. She managed a tight smile. "Denzel, I think we can agree that the goal here is clarity," she said, her voice carrying the slightest tremor of firmness. "No drama, just conversation." He sat back in his chair, arms resting on the sides with a stillness that felt powerful. "Conversation is fine," he replied, "as long as it's honest. Not angled." The words felt like another jab. A producer offstage waved frantically, urging Tamron to pivot, anything to cool the fire. But the audience was now on the edge of their seats, completely captivated by the moment. And Tamron knew if she abruptly backed down, it would look like she'd been checked. She couldn't let that happen. "Then let's be honest," she said finally. "When public figures speak, especially someone as influential as you, people listen, and yes, sometimes react. It's not always about twisting. Sometimes it's about accountability." Denzel's jaw flexed. Accountability goes both ways. Another ripple of gasps swept the room. Tamron opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, Denzel leaned slightly forward, his voice gentler but still charged. "Look, Tamron, I respect you. But I'm tired. Tired of people asking me to explain feelings I don't have and intentions I never had. Sometimes I say things bluntly. But that doesn't make me the villain." Tamron felt the sincerity in his tone, but the resentment behind it was unmistakable. She softened slightly. "No one's calling you a villain. You don't have to," he said. "That's how it's painted." Before Tamron could respond, a stage manager wearing a headset stepped onto the edge of the set, an almost unheard of breach during a live taping. He whispered urgently toward Tamron and then to Denzel. Though the microphones couldn't pick up the exchange, the body language was clear, things were getting too heated. They wanted a break. They wanted control restored. Tamron nodded slightly, but Denzel's expression hardened. He wasn't done. With a suddenness that made several audience members flinch, he stood up, slow, deliberate. Undeniably commanding. "If you want me here," he said, looking directly at the stage manager, "let me speak. If not," he gestured toward the hallway backstage, "I'll walk." The air froze. Tamron stood too, more out of instinct than intention. "Denzel, please, let's not escalate this." "I'm not escalating anything," he said firmly. "I'm standing up for myself." The studio lights felt hotter. The audience whispered anxiously. Producers exchanged alarmed glances. This was no longer just tense, it was volatile. Tamron stepped closer, lowering her voice while keeping it steady. "We're live. Millions are watching. Let's sit, finish the segment, and we can talk backstage afterward. No pressure." But Denzel shook his head. "You invited me here, then you turned the conversation into something it wasn't supposed to be." "I asked a question," Tamron countered. "One question. One loaded question," he corrected. "Designed to get a reaction." The energy shifted sharply again. At this point, the head producer sprinted onto stage, waving his arms. "Cut to commercial. Cut to commercial," he barked. The screens instantly shifted to a promotional bumper, and the studio lights dropped slightly as the broadcast went off air. A collective exhale swept through the room, but the real storm was still brewing. Tamron rubbed her temples as several staff members rushed forward to mediate, but Denzel held up a hand, signaling them to keep their distance. "I should go," he said quietly, though the force in his voice was unmistakable. "Denzel," Tamron tried again. "I came here in good faith," he continued, "but I won't sit somewhere I'm treated like a headline instead of a human." Before anyone could respond, he turned and began walking toward the exit corridor beside the stage, his stride purposeful, unwavering. A few audience members gasped, others whispered, and some looked genuinely heartbroken. "Security, hold, don't block him," the producer muttered into his headset, realizing the optics of trying to stop Denzel Washington would be catastrophic. Tamron followed halfway, stopping just short of the curtain. She watched him go, frustration and sadness mixing in her expression. She hadn't meant to upset him. She wasn't trying to provoke. But once a conversation turns emotional, even the best intentions can turn into sparks. As Denzel reached the door leading backstage, a final voice echoed behind him, Tamron's. "I never meant to disrespect you." He paused just long enough to speak without turning around. "I know, but intentions aren't the only things that matter." And then, With a quiet push, he walked out. The studio remained silent for several long seconds until the producer turned back to Tamron. "What do we do?" he whispered. Tamron exhaled deeply. "We tell the truth," she said. "We finish the show, and we don't pretend it didn't happen." When the cameras returned from commercial break, the chair across from her sat empty, a striking symbol of the clash that had unfolded. Tamron straightened her posture, looked into the lens, and began addressing the audience with measured calm. But the story, Denzel Washington being kicked off Tamron Hall's show after a heated confrontation, was already cemented. And the world was about to talk.